It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Roquinaldo Ferreira. He is a Vasco da Gama Associate Professor in the History Department at the Portuguese and Brazilian Studies Department at Brown University. He received his PhD in African History from UCLA in 2003. Before coming to Brown in 2013, he taught at the University of Virginia, and currently he's Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown. He is the author of Cross-Cultural Exchange in the Atlantic World and Valley and Brazil during the era of slave trade. So we are happy to have him with us today, and now I turn the floor to Professor Roquinaldo Ferreira.
Thank you very much, and it is my pleasure to be here, meeting some of my mentors, some of my friends, several of my friends, and meeting new people. So what I'm going to be doing today, and first I need to get rid of this, I'm going to be dividing this presentation into two chapters or two sections. The first one will outline the history of the relationship between Angola and Brazil up to the early 19th century, essentially up to Brazilian independence in 1822. So this first section is essentially based on a book that came out, a book by me that came out 3 years ago. And the second section deals with the relationship between, in the South Atlantic, the reconfiguration of the geopolitics in the South Atlantic in the 19th century, which is one of the book projects that I'm developing now. The few people who know me know that I like to use a lot of microhistory. I like to use personal trajectories. I like to piece together information about people to write about macro processes. So I'm dealing with issues that relate to the end of the slave trade, issues that relate to the rise of colonialism in Central Africa in the 19th century. And by the way, I see the slave trade as a process, or the end of the slave trade as a process that essentially paves the way for the rise of colonialism in Africa in the 19th century. It is very important to keep in mind what we call an Atlantic history framework to understand that, because my argument is that in the Portuguese case, the decolonization of Brazil, the end of Portuguese power or colonialism in Brazil intertwines with the rise of Portuguese colonialism in Africa, which in turn relates to the end of the slave trade. So those are the central questions that I'm dealing with. In many ways, we do find scholars that in the past have written about these issues, both in terms of Portuguese colonialism and in terms of British and French colonialism. So this book project that I'm working on, it is a history of what we call the Lusophone world, but it is also a comparative history of empires. By that I mean that I'm in conversation with people or scholars such as Robin Long, scholars such as Bishop Hussey, who work on the British case and demonstrate that the process of suppressing the slave trade intertwines with mechanisms of colonialism in Africa. So this is the type of dialogue that I'm interested in, not only in terms of connecting with people writing about the Lusophone world, but also connecting with people writing about colonialism as a whole in the African case. But let me just step back and give you a little bit of a sense, a geographic sense, a visual sense of what I'm talking about. So one of the issues one of the regions, or the primary region that I'm talking about is Central Africa. That's Angola and Congo. This is a region that has a history, a deep history of engagement with the Atlantic, a deep history of engagement with Brazil. And what I mean by that is that in the context of the slave trade, in the context of the African diaspora, this is by far the most important region supplying labor to the Atlantic, on one hand. On the other hand, and here we see Rwanda and Benguela and the Portuguese colony of Angola. It never really developed in the 17th and 18th century like Brazil. It was not a fully fledged colony, in other words, but it does provide the Portuguese with a stronghold in Africa. It means that the Portuguese case is unique in terms of their ability to engage with the African continent. To give you a sense of comparison here, drawing parallels to the French and the British case. In the 17th century, the British and the Dutch and the French were very active in West Africa. However, they were by and large along the coast. They were able to build forts along the coast, but they were never really able to establish an area, a colonial enclave, such as Angola. So this gives a specificity to the Portuguese case that it is important to keep in mind. So the two central areas are Luanda, which is the capital city of the colony of Angola. Another city that I'm going to be talking about a lot is not indicated on the, it is indicated on the map here, Benguela. It's the second largest city in pre-19th century Angola. It's essentially a settlement with perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people in the 1840s. Now, I pointed out that Angola plays a critical role in the context of the slave trade. What I did not say is that the vast majority of people taking from this area are being taken across the Atlantic to Brazil. So the connection with Brazil here is another key element that I would like to highlight. So this is the capital city of Angola in the 19th century. I see people here who have done field work in Angola, and this landscape is going to be very familiar to them. I used to live here, near the fort. Downtown Luanda is being completely transformed these days, but we still do find colonial buildings like the ones we see on this in this image. This is from the late 19th century. It's a postcard from probably the 1880s. Luanda is, once again, very important in the slave trade, and I can give you numbers to drive this home. It is very likely that some 2.5 million people were taken from this area to the Americas. So that means that this is by far the most important slave port in the history of the slave trade. It is a big deal. Right? This importance, unfortunately, is not really fully represented on the scholarship. The scholarship of the slave trade deals mostly, I would say, with the British case, perhaps a little bit with the French case, but not so much with the Angolan Portuguese case. This is shifting now, but we still have a long way to go in terms of fully understanding dynamics on the ground, driving the slave trade, particularly the internal slave trade in Angola. This is another image of also late 19th century, 1870s. This is also Luanda. We see an urban setting, which is, at this point in time, a city that was, let me see, 300-year-old. It's a big deal. Once again, the British at that point in time were in the process of developing something similar to what the Portuguese had done in the 17th century. Okay? In the British case, the critical turning point is the takeover of Lagos in 1861. Okay? Of course, there is a British colony, the British colony of Sierra Leone, but that's a very specific case. Let me see. This image, which should be very familiar to many of you, highlights the slave trade from these areas, and it shows very clearly the size and the magnitude of the slave trade coming out of Central Africa. We see that perhaps, I would say, 2/3 of the enslaved Africans taken from Angola and Congo were probably taken to Brazil. The connection is very strong with Rio and Pernambuco, but there is also some connection with Bahia, Salvador. But also we will find people, enslaved people from Central Africa pretty much everywhere in the Americas. In the 16th century, you're going to find them in Mexico. In the 19th century, in the late 18th century, as Cuba develops or transitions from being a society with slaves to a slave society, a lot of people brought into Cuba will be coming from Central Africa. And in the 19th century, this is a slave trade which is something that I develop in my book. This is a slave trade that, first of all, is illegal in the 19th century, beginning in the 1820s. And second of all, it is a slave trade that's going to thrive despite illegality. It is a slave trade that's going to connect Central Africa to Cuba, Brazil, Portugal, and to New York as well, because of the funding of the slave trade, which to some extent is coming out of the U.S. So this is a little bit of an outline of the connections of Angola with the Atlantic. When it comes to the connections with Brazil, to me, the critical question is, on one hand, why does Brazil end up being the destination of perhaps half of the entire slave trade? So in other words, if we consider that the slave trade affected some 12 million people, perhaps 5 million people were taken to Brazil. So that's the first question that for me is mind-boggling. The second one, why are the vast majority of these people coming from Central Africa? So the relationship, in my view, should be understood in three ways. There is obviously a commercial component to this relationship, and by that I mean that the funding that's driving the slave trade in Angola is coming to a large extent, not exclusively from Brazil. There is also a military geopolitical component that is framing this relationship. By that I mean that prior to the 19th century, the Portuguese, in order to develop colonialism in Central Africa, in order to carve out a colonial enclave in Central Africa, they will rely on Brazil. They will rely on Brazil for soldiers. They will rely on Brazil for individuals to staff the colonial administration in Angola. So there is a geopolitical component to the geopolitical / military component to this relationship. It is a process of integration that takes place in a way that makes, and this is very ironic, makes Portugal sometimes somewhat secondary in this relationship. It is a relationship that's also framed in a bilateral way that connects Brazil directly to Africa. Now, I have pointed out two elements to this relationship: the geopolitical/military component, the commercial component, which we can spell that out later, but there is another component that to me it is absolutely critical. It is a component that for us to have a good grasp of the importance of this issue, we really need to develop a more of a micro-history of the relationships, the social and cultural relationships between these two regions. Relationships that will be developed by people that we should not consider them and look at them as abstractions. People who would have families on both sides of the Atlantic. It is a relationship that entails a lot of polycultural societies or communities. So we are talking about people who would, for example, send their offspring from Angola to Brazil for education, essentially making them bicultural. And then, needless to say, these people will return to Angola and will engage in the slave trade. So the point I'm trying to make is that to understand why the connection between Angola and Brazil is so tight and so dynamic and so resilient, we need to account for the multidimensional nature of this connection. This is not only about business, there is more at play here. There are processes of identity formation at play. Okay, this outlines the complexity of this relationship up to the 18th century. But as I pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, there is a turning point. There is an inflection here. And I would say that the inflection will change the geopolitics of the South Atlantic. This inflection takes place in 1822 as Brazil breaks away from Portuguese colonial grip. And this is something that, of course, it has been analyzed by other people. In the 1960s, in the 1970s, we could go on to specify, to give names to names. But I would say that my take on this, once again, is to look at this history, is to try to write new histories that break away or push the envelope in terms of this master narrative of how the Portuguese were able to build a new Brazil in Africa after they lost Brazil. I hope I'm being clear here. It is a master narrative that highlights the state, the economy, and so forth. It is valuable as an analytical device. I'm not being entirely iconoclastic here at all. But I would suggest that by developing a little bit of a micro-history here, by piecing together information about real people, we can perhaps develop new ways to understand the complexity of this transition from Brazil to Africa. This process of empire building in the 19th century by a nation that was impoverished, by a nation that was plagued by political instability, and by that I mean Portugal. facing fierce competition by the British and other European powers. And I do that by looking at a family. That's the microhistory element here. I trace the history of a family, 2 generations of a family. The family is called Ferreira Gomes. The family caught my attention. The eldest member of the family caught my attention in 1824 when I was analyzing the impact of the independence of Brazil on the African side. In 1824, this man, Francisco Ferreira Gomes, was arrested on the charge or accusation of being the leader of a revolt in Benguela, a revolt that would essentially lead Benguela to break away from Portugal and become essentially an overseas province of independent Brazil. It speaks to the relationship, the very intense relationship between Angola and Brazil. It doesn't look very surprising to me that the elite, the Benguela elite that's deeply involved in the slave trade, would choose Brazil over Portugal after Brazil became independent. But however, in addition to being an anti-colonial leader, quote unquote, Ferreira Gomes was also accused of being anti-white people. He, according to the Portuguese, wanted to wipe out the white population of Benguela. Imagine that. In the early 19th century, we find this revolt that allegedly, presumably, is driven by anti-white, anti-European sentiment in Benguela, in Angola. That significantly complicates the chronology of anti-colonial movements in Africa, at the very least. Now, that's the first generation of the family. There's a lot to be said about this individual. Okay? He was born in Brazil. He was a Brazilian. He was born in Rio de Janeiro. He was sent to Benguela, to Angola, as a criminal exile. I have information that strongly suggests that he was an enslaved person in Brazil. This is a black man who is taken to Africa, to Angola, as a criminal exile, and then eventually becomes himself a very wealthy person by way of engaging in the slave trade. So he was responsible for the shipment of some 7,000 people to Brazil. I got all this information about him and much more from Angolan, Portuguese, and Brazilian archives. Essentially, to write this sort of microhistory, you have to go to many archives across the Atlantic. So this is just a snapshot into Francisco Ferreira Gomes' trajectory and the accusations against him. Now, Francisco Ferreira Gomes sent his child, his oldest child, to Brazil to be educated in Brazil. The deal was that the child would eventually come back to Benguela, which he did. And he comes to Benguela and he becomes a partner of his father. This is by now a bicultural man. He marries, his father had married the daughter of an African chief, of an African ruler. That's Francisco Ferreira Gomes. His son goes to Brazil, is educated in Rio de Janeiro, returns to Angola as, I would imagine, a very polished man, kind of sophisticated person, right? But he is gonna marry into the African nobility too. There is a pattern here. But what's most interesting to me in this presentation is the fact that José Ferreira Gomes, the son, like his father, he was also accused by the Portuguese of putting together a revolt, which, and I'm basically quoting from the documentation, if successful, would have eliminated the white population of Benguela. Needless to say, the Portuguese got really deeply upset about this. I have the numbers, the statistical data about the number of white people in Benguela vis-a-vis the number of black and mixed race people. Do I need to tell you that the number of black people and mixed race people is vastly superior than the number of white people? The population, the white European, white and locally born population is tiny little in relation to the majority of blacks and mixed race people. They could easily overwhelm the white population. They could easily get rid of the Portuguese. They could easily, really, irreversibly undermine the colonial regime there. An interesting caveat about this revolt in 1835 is that by that point, the eldest, the patriarch of the family, was back to Brazil. So while his son was in Angola, in Benguela, agitating against the colonial regime, the father was in Rio de Janeiro. However, the deal was that eventually the father would make his way to Benguela and become the leader of the city. He would also wipe out the white people. Now, this is the second generation of the family. In 1835, by that point, we have two branches of the family, actually. One branch in Benguela, in Angola, a second branch in Rio de Janeiro. The second branch in Rio de Janeiro was comprised of the patriarch who goes to Rio de Janeiro, who retires in Rio de Janeiro after 30 years in Benguela, and brings with him his African wife, his Angolan-born wife, and their two daughters. The Angolan branch of the family was led by José Ferreira Gomes, the man who was charged with the accusations in 1835. Now, 10 years later, the same José Ferreira Gomes is again accused of putting together another revolt against the Portuguese. In order to crack down on the revolt in 1845, or to crush that revolt, the Portuguese had to mobilize warships and hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers taken to Benguela to crush the rebels. Once again, the deal was that José Ferreira Gomes would, by now this is not surprising, he would try to get rid of the white population of Benguela. He is by now this fierce anti-white person out to get the white people in Benguela. So this begs several questions, right? Intriguing questions. What's really going on here? Why all this anxiety? I would argue that neither of these guys were really very much anti-white people. In fact, the Portuguese accused them, particularly José Ferreira Gomes, of making alliances with African rulers, making alliances with an African ruler that, by the way, was José Ferreira Gomes' cousin, a very powerful African ruler. But there is a detail in this relationship that undermines Portuguese focus and Portuguese explanation that the revolts, or these revolts, were driven by race. As the Portuguese went after José Ferreira Gomes in 1845, the leader of the revolt tried to escape and went to his cousin's village. As the Portuguese closed in on the village, they spoke to the ruler, to the African ruler, who was the cousin of José Ferreira Gomes. The African ruler said to the Portuguese that, first of all, he would not turn his cousin over to the Portuguese because he was his cousin, and those ties, kinship ties, really mattered in Africa. But on top of that, he also said that the Portuguese should find José Ferreira Gomes on their own, because José Ferreira Gomes was a white person like the Portuguese. José Ferreira Gomes, who is the offspring of a black man from Brazil, and a black African woman, was considered as a white person by the black people who presumably he was trying to convince to turn against the Portuguese. So, fascinating stuff, right? He was seen as a white person, by the way, because of his education, because he very likely spoke a very polished Portuguese in addition to whatever language he was speaking, very likely Umbundu. And because of the way he dressed, he was a member of the colonial society. So, because of that, Africans saw him as a white person. As you can tell, culture overrides race in that society, if you are an African person. But if you are a Portuguese person, from the point of view of the colonial regime, from the point of view of colonial authorities, and I'm going to use this to wrap this up, very likely the Portuguese were very willing to frame this as a racial event, as racial revolts, and we saw 3 of them, because the Portuguese are using or reading Africa, reading Angola, by using lenses that they would use to read what's going on in Brazil. It is in Brazil that we find a lot of anti-Portuguese sentiment in the 19th century, not only in the first half of the 19th century, but also throughout the 19th century. So this deep-seated anti-white/Portuguese sentiment is something that's going on in Brazil. It's something that, by the way, is driving several regional revolts in Brazil, not anti-colonial revolts, because Brazil was by then an independent nation, but an independent nation in which the process of nation building takes at least 30 years, and it is far from being the peaceful business that sometimes we assume it was. So I guess a key question here is, how do the Portuguese in Angola get to know what's going on in Brazil? They do get to know what's going on in Brazil as a function of the very integrated nature of the South Atlantic. This is a place where people are crossing back and forth all the time. At least one of these revolts, the first one, the Portuguese in Angola, in Luanda, in the capital city of Angola, got to know about the revolt in Benguela, another Angolan city, by reading newspapers that had arrived from Brazil. Pretty significant in terms of highlighting how integrated the 2 sides of the Atlantic really were at that point in time. Thank you.
Do you mind if we open for questions?
Of course.
First of all, thank you very much for our contributions. It was amazing to hear I'd like to start. I have a question about the Brazilian side. So I am curious about how Brazilian elites, they were looking to these rebels, how they saw the fact that they were willing to belong to Brazilian Empire, how they reacted, how they saw it.
From the point of view of Brazil, in terms of, I look at that by trying to understand transformations in what I call the geopolitics, the South Atlantic geopolitics. At the end of the day, I'm writing about people like them. I'm piecing together information about individuals. But I am a social historian, so I'm concerned about change over time, and I'm concerned about macro processes. So to me, what's going on after Brazilian independence, a lot of what's going on revolves around this shift, or this changing nature of this South Atlantic geopolitics. In other words, Brazil, after it became independent, did make a point of or signing a treaty with the British, the treaty of recognition of Brazilian independence, a critical document, because without this treaty you don't have access to Europe in terms of selling goods to the British, so it is a big deal. It comes about 3 years after Brazilian independence, 1825. In that treaty, the British essentially forced the Brazilian government to make the commitment not to try to annex Portuguese colonies in Africa. This is 1825. However, 2 years later, the Brazilian government sent a warship, a fleet to Angola, 3 warships in Angola, presumably to protect Brazilian business in Central Africa, which at that point in time we all know that means the slave trade, which is booming at that point in time. So there is a military component to this Brazilian maneuvering beyond Brazil. Brazilian maneuvering across the Atlantic. But there is also another critical component, which is a diplomatic component. Brazil establishes its first consulate in Luanda in 1827. And I can tell you that the first Brazilian consul in Angola did not get along with the Portuguese officials, which increases Portuguese suspicion about what the Brazilians were really up to. So much so that the Portuguese will pass laws, will set up requirements for Brazilians trying to enter Angola and trying to become residents of Luanda in the 1840s, 1850s, okay? Almost like applying for a visa to come to the US from Brazil. We don't need that anymore. But that's how I see this dynamic playing out. I see Brazil trying to project power outside Brazil.
So, okay. Once again, about Francisco Ferreira Gomes. You said that he wanted to, or he considered what he was doing was an expansion of Brazil, a sort of Brazilian incorporating Rwanda Venezuela as part of Brazil. But the revolt, he was accused of being, it was an anti-white revolt. So what did he think, how did he think Brazil was going to integrate them if that was the objective of the revolt?
That's why to me, these accusations, and they're not entirely forgeries, but I always look at them as something to unpack instead of believing in them. So the accusations don't really add up. Very likely in 1824, what the Bengali elite wanted was more autonomy vis-a-vis Luanda. They did not want to break away from Portuguese colonialism. However, in order to crush these revolts, the Portuguese are going to frame it as a racial revolt that's very anti-colonial, and they will produce all these documents about these different revolts. I see this documentation, the accusations, as part of this process of dealing with what I would call nascent Angolan nativism in the 19th century. There is tension going on there, but the tension is a function of the growth of colonialism in the 19th century. The influx of Portuguese people into Angola, taking up, for example, jobs that up to that point had belonged, quote unquote, to the Angolan elite, and a backlash against that. So there's a lot to be said about this, also as it relates to the really African side, because what I'm calling this growth of Portuguese colonialism does have an impact on the African side to the extent that there is a Portuguese encroachment on African land, okay, to produce more goods to places such as Luanda and Benguela, particularly food supplies. These two cities were very dependent on Brazil, even for food supplies. And the Portuguese, as it tries to diminish Angolan dependence on Brazil, will break away from the slave trade, will try to suppress the slave trade to keep labor in Angola and develop in Angola. But it will also try to produce more food supplies in Angola. To do that, they take a very practical step, which is to take away African land. So we see this process of, growth of Portuguese European presence in Angola, and we see the revolt pretty much as a response to that.
The 7,000 slaves to Brazil by Ferreira Gomes, were they supplied by his father-in-law?
Likely, very likely. Although the father-in-law was the African chief of a village very close to Benguela. By and large, really the bulk of the enslaved people are coming from the interior. But, the African chiefs are facilitating this process. I found information about José Ferreira Gomes sending 100 carriers into the Benguela highlands. Carriers taking goods into the interior of the region, goods that will eventually be used in the slave trade in the Benguela highlands.
Very interesting presentation. I did not know about this particular story. Can you talk a little bit about the research component? How did you come across this story? And what was the process of tracking these people down the archives, and about your methodology? Talked a little bit about microhistory and its implications.
A lot of what I did relates to understanding how archives are put together in Portugal, in Brazil, and in Angola. So a lot of what I did, and I'm not alone in this classroom, or this room. The other people here who have spent time in Angola. I began doing my research there in 1995, when the Civil War was still going on. And the first time I went there, before going to Angola, people in Brazil would say to me, don't even bother to do that. It is suicidal because of the war, and you won't find anything. It turns out that there is a lot there. And it turns out that the local archives, they provide a different dimension to this history. So I would argue that the archives in Portugal are very rich, extremely rich, as we know. But they, I would argue that that documentation has a bias that I would say to what I call this macro history, which not ours, sometimes it glosses over this dailiness of colonialism. The dailiness of colonialism is what I'm interested in. The dailiness not only of colonialism, but the dailiness of colonial society. How people deal with each other, how they build these connections with people in Rwanda and Benguela. So by pursuing this information from local archives, and I set out to find specific information. I was trained in Brazil, and you get to be archive rat from the beginning. So as I go into Angola, I still remember my advisor telling me, you gotta find this, this, and this in terms of documents. So you come in with a recipe that has been tested in Brazil. A lot of what I do here might sound kind of new if you do African history. But I bet that for people who do Latin American history, this is not microhistory using people's trajectories to write macro social history. This is not, I would say, is not really entirely groundbreaking. It is new if you look from African history point of view. And that has to do with the development of African history, particularly in the US, and a certain reluctance to use or to rely on written documents, presumably by Europeans, which, by the way, the documents here are in Portuguese, but oftentimes written by Africans. So, but essentially, see microhistory as a tool to write social history, a more complex social history, a more nuanced social history. But to me, is social history.
More questions? Ronaldo, thank you very much for your contribution to the Brazil lecture series. We're going to go through the lecture series before looking to relations between Brazil and Africa. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you gave us this wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.